Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome, and joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 best books that influenced her the most on her life journey is publishing legend, entrepreneur, founder of the Conscious Cafe, bereavement counsellor and more, Judy Piatkus. Long before the bestseller charts were packed with mind, body, spirit, business and relationship books, Judy Piatkus created a platform for new voices and leading authorities and experts in their field, introducing some of today's most influential writers, authors, and spiritual teachers to the world. In 1979, while still in her 20s, with no university degree, no professional qualifications, no financial backing, and no authors, Judy Piatkus founded Piatkus Books from her spare bedroom and grew the company to become an internationally recognized brand. She literally taught herself how to be a publisher while also looking after a young family that included a child with severe cerebral palsy. She was a woman entrepreneur at a time when there were very few of those, and she went on to play a pivotal role in creating and shaping the cultural and professional perceptions of personal growth and development publishing. Judy Piatkus, welcome.
Hi, Sandy. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
We're so happy to have you here. I know there's an awful lot of people who want to know what goes on behind the publishing, facade and how they can get into that business as well. It's such a fascinating industry. And, I remember those days when you were starting. There were so few books around at that time. The ones that were available seemed to be from Nelson's and very old esoteric publishers. But you just pretty much single-handedly expanded that whole genre. So kudos to you. We've all got a lot to thank you for.
Well, thank you. When I started the company, which was actually in 1979, but we got going with nonfiction in the early 1980s. And at that time, there were around 50 or 60,000 new books. This is every kind of book that was being published. And that had doubled within the next 20 years. And now that everybody can self-publish their own book if they want to, there's hundreds of thousands of new books coming onto the marketplace. It's wonderful that everybody has the chance to self-publish, and that's really special. But it does mean that for the discerning reader, you've got a lot more books to choose from, and it can be harder to find the books that are right for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why we started this, so that we can at least get some great recommendations from people like you, and other people have got some pointers of where to look. So tell us, Judy, thousands of books must have passed through your hands, and you read more than the average person. What was it like to choose 10? Although I know you didn't choose 10, you actually slid a few more in there. But what was it like for you to have to do that?
It was interesting because I had just written my memoir ahead of her time, and because I had to sort out for the writing of that memoir, which is a business memoir about the company, Piatkus Books. It's actually for entrepreneurs and it's about growing a company. But as I grew a publishing company, and when I wanted to make examples of various things that I had experienced, I'd had to actually sift out some books that I wanted to mention in my own book. So I have to say, Sandy, that did make it a lot easier. But not every book that I've chosen today was published by Piatkus. And what I did was I went down and I had a look at the books that I've got on my own bookshelf downstairs. And so obviously that was very helpful. But it was an interesting challenge to choose 10 of my favorite books. And as you said, I couldn't manage it because with one author, I had to slip in a few more. But, I'm used to breaking the rules, so that wasn't a problem.
Reading your list, it almost feels like you had a peek into my life at that time, because I would say about 6 or 7 of the books on your list are all books that were on my shelves over the years. And especially in the earlier days, some of those books that were published back in the 80s and the early 90s. So for me, it was like, oh, I remember that. Oh, I remember that one too. So let's start with the first one on your list. And are these in chronological order? Are they in the order that you read them?
They're in the order that they popped into my head. Well, actually, what I did was when I began to write the notes for the selection, I'd actually got the pile of books next to me, and I think it's just the order that I took them off the top of the pile.
Okay, so the first book on your list is The Dance of Anger, A Woman's Guide to Changing the Patterns of Intimate Relationships by Harriet Goldhall Lerner. That is a book that made a massive impact on me. So tell me how you felt reading it.
Well, I think that book would have been the first book in my head, because actually there was another book. There was another book in my mid-30s which did impact on me, but it wasn't spiritual, so I didn't list it. So I would say this was the first book which impacted on me more in the area of personal growth, because I read it when I was 37. And prior to that, I hadn't really appreciated how angry I was about certain things and certain relationships in my life. I had been so used to being a good girl, a people pleaser, and my astrological sign is Libra, so I tend to want to live in harmony. And this book awakened me to feeling anger. I'd been brought up by quite Victorian parents. They were Victorian in their outlook. I think their parents were fairly strict. And so I'd been brought up to be seen and not heard, be a good little girl. Nobody was that interested in my opinion. I had loving parents, but they were the product of their own parents. So I wasn't really allowed to be angry as a young child, and I didn't understand much about anger. And The Dance of Anger showed me how angry I was, how I was used to repressing it, how I absorbed it, how it might leak out in different unexpected ways. And so I learned a huge amount about managing it. And I was able to tell my mother for the first time that I didn't want her to criticize me so much. So reading this book, The Dance of Anger, really empowered me. And if anybody who's watching this or listening to this has a problem with anger and hasn't really explored the topic of anger in your own life, I thoroughly recommend it.
Yeah, it's a book that I've recommended to a lot of my friends, especially female friends. And I think one of the things I took away from it, it was a revelation to me as well, that this resentment that I was carrying was actually repressed anger. And it did enable me to, make a bit of a shift in my relationship with my own mother, because I hadn't realized till then how angry I was with her. Yeah. And I think this is something that women understand, especially, women of our generation. is, you know, we were taught to be the good girls and to just be decorative and be servile as well to the men. And I think there's, you know, that's a situation that is designed to make you angry, because why should we? Why should we have to be this? So I was really glad to see that on your list. It's the first time it's appeared. And you can always tell a great book by, you know, how many reprints there are. And that one is still out there. It's been reprinted so many times. She also did the dance of deception, was it? The Dance of Deception, I think. And then there was another third one as well. All of them brilliant books.
I didn't have the other two downstairs because I had given them away to people.
Yeah.
I'd had them on my shelf at one point. I'd lent them to people, and not surprisingly, I hadn't got them back. Yes, an amazing book, life-changing for many people.
Yeah. You know, when I look at the covers of some of these books, they really do take me back in time. I can see them on, you know, the bookshelf in the house that I was living in. And the same applies to the second on your list, which you say was to have consequences that changed your life. And that is The Power of Gems and Crystals by Susie Holbish. So tell us about that one.
Sandy, I'm so thrilled that you had that book on your shelf. That is really lovely. So The Power of Gems and Crystals was the first book that at Piatkus Books in the early 90s. It was the first book that we were published in the mind, body and spirit area. The Power of Gems and Crystals was written by a lovely English woman, Susie Holbeach, and she ran workshops on crystals, and these were very popular. And as publishers, we thought, well, Susie's obviously got a following. She will be able to sell the books at workshops. And we found there was very little competition on the market. Susie's book was very personal. But the reason that the book became so special in my life was because I had a session with Susie. And I hadn't realized before I went to the session when I say I had a session, Susie was a healer. And I knew that Susie worked with gems and crystals. What I hadn't realized was that she also did past life regression. And the reason I hadn't appreciated that is because when my colleagues at Piatkus gave me an early copy of the book to read, the introductory chapter about past life regression was missing. I think Susie probably wrote it last. So I hadn't realized that that was what she actually did. So when I found myself in her flat, she had a lovely soothing flat in Kew or Richmond, just in London. When I found myself lying on the bed there, and she said, right, well, I'm going to put you in a light trance, and I want you to tell me, when I wake you up, I want you to tell me where you are and what you can see. It was quite a shock. I had never previously had a past life regression session. And as I was her publisher, I couldn't admit that I didn't know that that was what her main work was. But the session was very valuable. Susie took me back to 3 past lives. And during those lives, I learned a lot about myself. And I learned that my mother was in one of the lives. And in another life, I was a leader, probably of a Viking tribe or somewhere in Scandinavia. And I hadn't always behaved well in my past lives. So the experience that I was having in my present life in London in the 1990s was karmic, and that was hugely valuable. But Susie also used her healing abilities to try to help me because I had a bad back at the time. So this whole experience lasted 3 hours, but the impact of it was to make me extremely curious and intrigued by the world of mind, body, and spirit. And that was my first introduction to thinking about the mystical world. And that was what turned me on to this whole area of publishing and of thinking differently about my life.
If Susie had written that first chapter on past life regression and you'd seen it before you bought the book, would you still have gone for it, or would you have thought it was too far out there?
I would definitely have gone for it, because as a publisher, I would have wanted to support my author in every way. And I certainly wouldn't have wanted my author, an author of a book that we had chosen to publish, I would never have wanted her to feel that I wasn't supportive of the work she was doing.
Yeah. I mean, you really were breaking new ground there, weren't you? You know, it's amazing when I think back on that time. And you talked about your own memoir as being a business memoir, but it's much more than that. I mean, for me, it brought back so many memories of that era and the books that I was reading, the books that I was discovering. I was, you know, on my own personal spiritual journey then. So you were creating books for people like me, you know, who were desperate to read more. And I bet there's a lot of people, you know, who would say the same thing, that it was the books that you published that helped them grow.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But at the beginning of our publishing program in this area, I don't think myself or my colleagues who were working with me, we were all fairly new to this. And so we didn't know that we had also embarked on our own personal journey of personal growth.
Yeah. Book number 3, Living Magically, A New Vision of Reality by Jill Edwards. So tell us about that one.
I have such affection for that book, because that was the first book that introduced me to metaphysics. And metaphysics could be described as ideas about the fundamental nature of reality, about abstract concepts such as time and energy and space. And Jill Edwards sent us a few chapters from this book that she was proposing to write. And I remember I had a reading day at home, and I was sitting in a comfortable armchair in my lounge, and I read these few chapters and I thought they were really interesting. And I showed them to my colleague at work, Jill Bailey, and we asked Jill Edwards to come in for a meeting. At the time, Jill Edwards had a radio program on one of London's popular radio stations. She was a clinical psychologist, and she was answering questions about psychology and also introducing many of her metaphysical ideas to the audience. And we really loved Jill. We thought she was a beautiful woman, and we commissioned her to finish writing the book, and we published it. And there was something about the title, Living Magically, in that the ideas in the book were so positive, so beautiful, so life-affirming, that readers began to love the book, and they all recommended it to one another by word of mouth. And this was interesting because a book about metaphysics was really hard to sell, but nevertheless, Jill also ran workshops, and she was on the radio, and she wrote articles, and gradually the book began to gain a huge readership. And we're talking about the early 1990s here, when books in this area were still very new. Bookshops were still not stocking very many of them. And Jill's book was definitely in the vanguard of books on metaphysics and encouraging people to think differently about the world that they live in.
It's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed over different interviews in this series is how many really good classic books, classics now, were published in the 80s and the 90s. And I often wonder whether, the harmonic convergence in 1987 seemed to spark off. It was almost like a turning point, I think, in the consciousness movement, and inspired so many people. And, and suddenly there's this flood of great material, The Alchemist, and, all of these wonderful books that we hear about again and again and again on this particular show, because so many people found them so valuable. So you were doing that at the same time that people were, on the other side of the world, were looking at books like The Alchemist.
Yes, I mean, I haven't got The Alchemist on my list, mainly because it's the kind of book that I've never quite loved as much. And so it's a parable, and it's a fantasy, and it's a story. And personally, I've never quite enjoyed books like that, unlike millions of other people. So that's why The Alchemist isn't on my list, but I was very aware of it at the time.
Yeah. Book number 4, Creating Money, Keys to Abundance by Sanaya Roman and Dwayne Packer. I had that one too. So, I mean, we hear it all the time today about creating money, ever since The Secret, The Law of Attraction, Esther and Jerry Hicks, etc. But this one was published in 1988, long before that. So how did this book impact you?
Well, Creating Money was actually a book that was recommended to me by Jill Edwards, and that was how I came across it. And this was a channeled book, so the authors received the information, and it reads absolutely beautifully. So as an entrepreneur and publisher of a small company, which was completely financed by myself. So we had to generate the money that we needed to grow all the time. And there were times when we really were short of money, if we hadn't sold enough books one month, if somebody was slow paying us. There can be so many reasons why a small company is short of money. And every time we were short of money, I would do a particular exercise that's in one of the chapters of this book, which was, it sort of showed you how to create a sort of imaginary magnet and magnetize the amount of money that I needed. And so I'd visualize this magnet attracting all the money that I needed to be sent to us by people who owed us money. And usually the money came in. In fact, I can't remember a single time when the money we needed didn't arrive. And it was very interesting because sometimes it would come in the most unexpected ways. I remember we sometimes received amounts of money that we weren't even owed. And we'd ring up the people and say, well, we've received this money from you, but we don't know what it's for, or we haven't invoiced you. And they'd say, oh, we do owe it to you. It's fine. It's yours to keep. It was quite miraculous. Creating Money, the book, also makes you think differently about money. And it made me think differently about the things that I wanted, because it showed ways that you could have what you wanted without necessarily needing the money to purchase it. So now we have lots of books of abundance, lots of books about the law of attraction. And this was probably the forerunner, one of the forerunners to the law of attraction. And I think now we're sort of 30 years later than when it was published, we can actually attract money even more quickly. And the important thing is to be coming from the right place when we ask for the things that we want.
Yeah. Book number 5, again, another one on my shelf. Love this book. Many Lives, Many Masters. The true story of a prominent psychiatrist, his young patient, and the past life therapy that changed both their lives. I'm talking about Brian Weiss, of course, and that too was published in 1988.
Well, Many Lives, Many Masters is probably the book that most people have recommended to me. So I have found myself in so many situations where people have said that one of the books that impacted on them the most in the mind, body and spirit genre is Many Lives, Many Masters. And then they've asked me if I've read it. And then I sometimes say, a little bit humbly, I hope, well, I did publish it in the UK. So we were offered, I can't remember exactly whether we were offered this book or whether I became aware that it was not officially published in the UK. But in any event, it ended up on the Piatkus list. And we were very lucky because Brian Weiss was doing a lot of traveling in the early 1990s and the mid 1990s. And he came to the UK and he did publicity for us. We arranged for him to speak at Alternatives and we arranged for him to speak in Canterbury. And I remember having lunches and dinners and traveling down to Canterbury Waterstones with Brian. And he was the most lovely, unassuming man. And his book tells about how he, as a therapist, was working with a client who began to tell him about experiences that she was having between different lives. And it's really, really remarkable. And I think it's opened people's minds to the idea that when we die, our soul carries on. And of course, more than 2/3 of the population on the planet believe in reincarnation. But in the Western world, we're still deciding. And many of us are still deciding how we think and how we feel about reincarnation. And what Brian's book did, as he was a well-established and highly regarded doctor, what it did was encourage people to reflect on reincarnation and that there might be so much more to our lives and our mortality in this world at this time than we could ever previously have imagined.
Yeah. And it is, as you say, it is the go-to book in this genre. I mean, this is where most people start.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Number 6. Oh, this book had me doing all kinds of things. Creating Sacred Space with Feng Shui. And you've also got Clear Your Clutter with Feng Shui by Karen Kingston, published in 1996 and 1997, respectively. And I learned everything I needed to know about Feng Shui from these books. And I had red ribbons going up the banisters of the stairs through my house and doing all sorts of things. And it worked.
Well, it's really interesting that I'm having this conversation with you today, Sandy, because Karen Kingston's books have impacted on me so profoundly. And I walked into the front door of the block of flats where I live today. And there's some gardeners who sort of come every couple of weeks and look after the communal parts. And last time they were here, they left a beautiful plant, lovely planted flowering shrubs in front of the front door. And just behind this shrub in a little bed, there was this plant that looked like it was dying. And when I came into the building today, there were the gardeners. And I explained to them that if you've got a dying plant as you walk into the entrance of your building, that's not very good Feng Shui, because you don't really want to be thinking about dead plants or looking at dead plants every time you go in and out your front door. So I said to them, it's about living harmoniously and it's about everything being in its place. It's about geomancy. And it's about how when things around us are not placed exactly where they feel right, then we unconsciously don't feel quite as relaxed and at peace with our surroundings as we would be if objects and items were in the right place. So Karen's first book with Creating Sacred Space with Feng Shui was really impactful, so much so that I booked a holiday to Bali because Karen writes about Bali, where she was living at the time, in the book. And that was fabulous. And one of the chapters in the book about clearing your clutter became a little book on its own and was probably the book that we originated ourselves at Piatkus, which sold the most copies in the whole of my publishing career. Wow. So I have special affection for Clear Your Clutter with Feng Shui, which incidentally spawned the whole movement of decluttering.
Yeah, yeah. And I do remember that so clearly. I remember, it was a challenging time in my life. And so I thought, I'm going to change this and I'm going to do everything that she said. And I did. And I've watched miracles happen. And it was like, this is so cool. Yeah. Number 7. Wow. Debbie Shapiro, Your Body Speaks Your Mind. Understand how your emotions affect your health. Again, that's another one, 1996. You call it your favorite reference book. Why your favorite?
I think Your Body Speaks Your Mind is my favorite in that it's the one that I go to most often. And the reason I go to it most often is because I and my immediate family and close friends, if they want me to, we all have health problems occasionally, even if it's something like a small pain in a particular part of your body, or maybe your knees aren't so good, or your right knee or your left knee. And so this is the book that I have used as a Bible, because what Debbie says is that our emotions impact our physical body. We're a holistic system. Our emotions are not separate from our body. But what's really interesting is that when we have a pain in a different part of our body, that will indicate what emotion is troubling us. And we might not have recognized how much that emotion is troubling us. So, for example, if we just think about our hearts, we talk about heartache. So very sadly, if you were having a difficult time with a relationship, or perhaps you'd lost someone dear to you and you were feeling heartbroken, it's perhaps not that surprising if a few years later you might have problems with your heart. So each part of our body expresses something. If we have a sore throat, or if we find ourselves unable to speak, we might want to ask ourselves what we're not expressing. If we have a problem with our eyes, we might ask the question, what am I not seeing? And in the book, Debbie gives us all the questions to ask. And so she encourages thoughtfulness about what's going on in your life that could be causing a particular physical problem.
Yeah, I mean, we have all these phrases, don't we? Like, somebody being a pain in the neck. And we don't tend to relate it to the pains that we have in our neck. This is very similar to Louise Hay, You Can Heal Your Life, isn't it? I mean, all of the symptoms that we have that we need to look at and check our emotions.
Definitely.
Yeah. So did that come out before Louise Hay's book? Do you know?
It came out after. And I think where it differs from Louise Hay's book is that you've got there's quite a bit more. You've got Debbie's version, you've got Debbie's text, you've got Debbie's questions, and so I think that there's a room on all our shelves for both books.
Yeah. So the next one isn't one; it's actually 3. This is the set that you had to choose them all. Love's Executioner and Other Tales of Psychotherapy, Mama and the Meaning of Life, Tales of Psychotherapy, and A Matter of Death and Life. And they're all by Irvin Yalom. So what is it about these books? I know you've studied psychotherapy. What is it about these books that you like?
Well, I love the way Yalom writes. And it doesn't matter which of the books I'm reading, there's always this moment when I think to myself, oh, this man is such a beautiful writer. He is such a profound and wonderful storyteller. And the first book of his that I read was Love's Executioner. And that wasn't published by Piatkus. It was actually published at the time by Bloomsbury. And it's tales of what happens in the therapy room. And in the late 1990s, I did train as a counsellor and subsequently achieved a diploma as a psychodynamic psychotherapist and counsellor. And although my process as a counsellor was different, I think actually Irvin Yalom's process was probably very particular to him, not necessarily one that many counsellors and therapists would use. Nevertheless, there is so much learning from all his books about human nature and about people and about how the challenges that all of us go through, how they impact on in our lives in such different ways, and how our behavior is a key to our unconscious. But the most recent book I read of Irvin Yalom's was written partly with his wife, Marilyn, and he, in later books, often mentions Marilyn, to whom he was married for 65 years. And the last book was written by both of them in alternate chapters. Marilyn knew she was dying of cancer, and she asked Irvin to write this book with her so that he could record for others to read his experiences of living with her with terminal cancer and how he felt, and she could record what it was like for her living with her husband, who hadn't really grasped how she was experiencing her last few months. So it's very profound. It sounds very sad, but I think it's also very warm because they were married so long and had such a wonderful, rich life together. So I do recommend it for understanding of life and death. And of course, we have a lot of taboos around death in our society. Not every society has had these taboos, but if we could talk about death more, many of us wouldn't be so afraid of it.
You know, I think it's really interesting to have both people's, you know, perceptions of an experience, because, as you know, as she said, and none of us can understand what somebody else is going through. None of us can, you know, unless we're going through it ourselves. And to have both views of something that so many people have to face, I would think that is very helpful. I mean, I spent a long time with my sister who was dying. I didn't know what that experience was like for her, but maybe if I'd read a book like this, it would have given me, you know, a little bit more insight than I was able to get on my own. Yeah, very powerful.
I think, you know, you have to be in a particular place on your life's journey to be ready to read it. But it's so beautifully written and it's so easy to read. He does tell the most wonderful stories.
So book number 9, A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose, Eckhart Tolle. And that was published in 2008. And this one turns up again and again and again on people's lists, as does The Power of Now.
Well, I think Eckhart Tolle came onto this planet with this wonderful gift, and his writing has opened up people's minds. Excuse me. His writing has opened up people's minds to so much about new ways of thinking about our lives, about our consciousness, about where we are on our life's journey. And there's so much to take from the book about the ego, about living in the present, living in the now, and about finding happiness, and about letting go of the baggage that we carry around with us, which gets in the way of living the best life that we can. So I feel very, very grateful to Eckhart Tolle for his wonderful contribution to so many people. And I read this book so many times when it first came out. And then I wanted to put it back onto my list of 10 because it has had such an impact on me. And I began to read it again for this program, and it just reminded me of where I had been when I first began to read it in 2008, 2009, and how far along the road I traveled. And I sometimes think that our mystic journey is like an onion. And the more we learn, the more layers are peeled away, and the more we understand of mystical books that we read. So I thought I understood a lot of it at that time, but now I understood so much more, which I hadn't realized that I wouldn't have understood at that time.
Is it a book that you would have loved to have published?
Oh, absolutely, definitely. I think life as a publisher was full of books that we would have liked to publish. Sometimes we offered for them and we actually couldn't afford to pay the high advance. But we were never offered the power of now. Some books were not meant to be published by us, but we did publish books that other publishers wished that they had published. So all publishers end up with some books that they feel very grateful to have on their lists.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I can't think of anything nicer than, finding a book that you think is so valuable to everybody and being able to get it out into the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So number 10, this is a book. Again, I haven't read this particular book, but I'm very familiar with the story behind the person who did write it, which is Eileen Caddy. And the book is Opening Doors Within, published in 1992. And Eileen, of course, was one of the founders of Findhorn Spiritual Community in Scotland. So tell us about this book.
Well, as I began to familiarize myself with what was on the bookshelves in the early 1990s in the area of mind, body, and spirit, Eileen Caddy's books were usually in most shops because, Sandy, as you said at the beginning of this program, in the early 90s, there weren't very many books. There were really very few books. And so Eileen Caddy was stocked well, and people were talking about Findhorn, and people were going to Findhorn, and lots of our authors spoke and lectured at Findhorn. And so I read the story of Findhorn, and I read the other books that she wrote. But I think the reason that I've put Opening Doors Within on this list is because there is a meditation in this book for every day. And some authors write quite brief meditations, but hers were they were only a page, but there was always a lot in them. Each meditation, I suppose about 200 words, was very profound. And I would open the book sometimes I would open the book on a particular page, and sometimes I can't remember if they were dated or not. Well, sometimes I'd just open the book and see, and it was like I'd be asking for the meditation that was appropriate for me on that day, a bit like opening oracle cards and just taking your card and seeing which one's right for you now at this moment. And the meditation always had a profound message for me. And that gave me a lot to reflect on every day. And I would say now, thinking about it, because you've asked me about this book, I have probably read something spiritual every day, either from a book or since the internet began to offer so much, or something on the internet. I probably read something spiritual, just one paragraph, one piece, one blog, one post every single day. And hopefully that keeps in the forefront of my mind always the question of what is the right decision to make, and also thinking about my ego. When am I coming from my ego? And just trying to know myself better. And I think possibly this habit of doing my best every day to have greater understanding of myself and myself in relation to other people so that I can be helpful. This might even stem from reading Eileen Caddy every day.
Yeah, you did say in your write-up, you told a story about being on a business trip to Australia when you found some cards with Eileen's words on them.
That's absolutely right. And I was so thrilled, and there was a whole set of them. I've only got one left now, and I keep it on my desk, and I'm happy to read it to you. And this one says, set your sights high. The higher, the better. Expect the most wonderful things to happen, not in the future, but right now. Realize that nothing is too good. Allow absolutely nothing to hamper you or hold you up in any way. And this card's got a lovely red poppy on it. And I'm just looking to see, there isn't a date when it was produced. But there were a few, and I don't think an English card publisher would have produced them. But in Australia at that time, it was probably about 20 years ago, Australia's always been in the forefront of new thinking, new ideas about mind, body and spirit. And so I'm sure there would have been a ready market for the card. And I just love having that card on the desk next to my computer, reminding me just to keep my consciousness high. And just believe in the good things in life, which of course has been quite a challenge for all of us in the last couple of years in particular.
Well, that completes your 10 best list. Tell us, what are you reading now, apart from the rereading of Eckhart Tolle's book?
Well, you've really challenged me there, Sandy, because I've just come back from holiday and I was reading crime novels and literary fiction. I've just read totally different kinds of things. I don't usually read a lot of spiritual books on holiday. I tend to read them sort of when I'm in London. So I've just been reading popular crime writers like Anne Cleeves, Ian Rankin. I just read someone who wrote a prize-winning novel. There's an author I like called Linda Grant. Lots of women's fiction. So I haven't been reading anything spiritual just at the moment. But as I say, my spiritual reading tends to be not so much books just at the moment, but more shorter paragraphs and blog posts.
What was the last thing that you read that really excited you? You know, really opened something up within you, inspired you?
I think I needed some notice of that question. I think what's important is that I need to be constantly reminded to keep my energy high. Because what I believe is that as more and more people on the planet have their minds opened to new ways of thinking about mysticism, about consciousness, about our energy, about how we live, about karma, about reincarnation, about being of service to the planet, to the people on the planet, to the people around us. As we think more about being of service, then we light up the planet, because people want to be around us. They want to enjoy our more positive thinking, the light within us that we're sharing with them. And when times are very tough, we need the people who are carrying and sharing that light to light the way ahead for people who are anxious and worrying and depressed. So that we can help them. And as more and more of us can just keep our energy high, then hopefully that will spread over more of the planet. And we won't have so many difficult challenges to deal with as we have at the moment.
Yeah, true. In the introduction to your list that's published on the website, you said something. you said that as a younger woman in your 20s and 30s, you thought your purpose in life was to be a publisher and sell books. In your 40s and 50s, you realized that your colleagues and you had been given a much greater responsibility, that of opening people's minds to new ideas and new ways of thinking about their lives and the experiences they were having. Your task was truly to help raise people's consciousness through the books that you were offering to the world. That realization, when that realization came to you, I mean, was it a kind of mind-blowing moment in your life, or was that something that you gradually became aware of?
Well, one of the things about being a publisher of personal development and personal growth books is that we would read them in the office. And even if we chose not to publish them, we would always learn something from them. And we would also read books that other publishers were producing, partly for enjoyment and partly to see why they were successful. So the time came when everybody was talking about purpose. And I realized that my purpose had, when I first became aware of purpose, which I think I did possibly from a book called Your Best Year Ahead or something, I thought it was fairly straightforward. I was in my 40s. I was probably a few years into the discovery of mind, body, and spirit and personal growth. And I thought, oh, well, I'm here to publish useful, helpful books for people. But as I read more and as I expanded in thinking myself, I realized that my purpose was actually to open people's minds to new ways of thinking, because they might not be reading any of our books, but they might be hearing about our books because other people were reading them and talking about them and sharing the ideas. After I sold Piatkus Books, a few years later, I started an organization called Conscious Cafe. And Conscious Cafe brings people together in small groups for conversations about topics that are actually not topics that we often have with our friends and family. So we don't often talk about freedom or authenticity or happiness or self-love. We don't talk about those things very much. But actually, what Conscious Cafe offers is the space to talk with like-minded people about some of these abstract ideas. So we all have a purpose. And I personally think there's much too much emphasis on finding your purpose in your 20s and 30s and 40s, because as we grow and develop as individuals, our purpose expands, or it may change. I didn't discover the mind, body, and spirit world until I was in my early 40s. So in my 30s, my idea of what my purpose was, if anybody'd asked me, might have been quite different. So my purpose has been expanding during my lifetime in different ways. Mm. And I'm sure for all of you watching and listening, your purpose is expanding every day and will continue to expand as you learn new things.
Mm. I want to talk a little bit about the Conscious Cafe, because it is such a brilliant idea. It's something that is badly needed. And you started this back in 2011, and now you've got groups in countries all around the world. And, it's such a simple idea. And the best ones are simple, aren't they? And sometimes people meet up in person when, they're not being prevented because of COVID, and other times they're meeting online. And some of your groups have speakers who will talk about a topic. So I think that this is something whose time has come, something we're badly needing. Have you found that during lockdown, more and more people are wanting this than seem to want it before, because they understand the value of it now?
Before lockdown, we had groups in a number of places in the UK and a few groups abroad. When lockdown came, we moved on to Zoom, And we've offered a whole range of amazing keynote speakers. But what makes our Conscious Cafe events a little different, we hope, is that they're all interactive. So we would have a speaker come along and present ideas, and then we would give everybody in the audience an opportunity to ask lots of questions, which our host, usually Gina, would convey to the speaker. And in some of the events, we've also had breakout groups. So we gave people the opportunity to break into smaller groups, meet other people, and have small conversations, 3 or 4 people, about the topic that was being discussed. So people have found this hugely valuable, and especially those people who are happy to meet other people online. So now that we're coming out of lockdown, groups are gradually trying out some live meetings again. Each country, of course, has different rules and regulations. We can't say how things are going to develop in the future, but as you say, Sandy, we do appreciate that there's just a huge need for people to come together and talk about what they're really feeling. And at Conscious Cafe, we're concerned that people have a good quality experience. Even if they only come once, we hope they'll enjoy the experience. So we feel it's not about the numbers of people who come, it's about the experience you have when you do come.
Yeah. And obviously, just, so people know that you're open. Anybody who wants to start a group in their area can do so. You've got groups spreading in other countries now. And I'm sure this would be very popular in the USA. I know lots of people who've been looking for something like this. So who would they contact?
The best thing is to go to our website, which is www.consciouscafe.org. And if you write to info@consciouscafe.org, we will reply. And we do hope to have a group starting in America. It's quite a challenge to launch an online group, but nevertheless, we do hope to be able to overcome this challenge. And let us know if you're interested. But do remember that a leader of the group has to hold the space for everyone to have the conversation. So you are there to facilitate the conversation, and that is a wonderful gift that you're giving.
Yeah, indeed. So, Judy, all these years, books in your life, reading, publishing, critiquing, whatever you had to do, and then you write your own memoir. I mean, that's quite a turnaround. Did you approach that with a feeling of trepidation? Now you're on the other side of the fence. What must it be like, etc.? Will they like my book? Can I write? Tell us about that.
It's been quite a challenge becoming an author, and I have to say I've really, really enjoyed it, even though at times I have been really terrified. I wrote the book during 2019, and I had encouragement from an experienced freelance editor who I know. Excuse me. I found a literary agent, and she was able to place the book with Watkins, who have a wonderful list of mind, body and spirit books. And I was really pleased to be published by Watkins because they're an independent publisher. So it felt right that as I was writing my memoir ahead of her time, as I was writing it about being an independent publisher, it felt absolutely right to be published by an independent publisher. The few weeks before the book was published was quite terrifying because the publisher sent out early copies to readers who wanted to receive early copies of it. And I realized they could all start writing on social media what they thought of it, and that was horribly scary. And then when the moment came, the day of publication, then I thought, it's out there now. I have just got to surrender to whatever happens. And after that, everything got much easier. because I had been a publisher, I think it was easier for Watkins to manage my expectations as an author, in that I knew how everything worked. I know how many books are out there. I know what a challenge it is to try to reach the audience for your book. And I knew that I would need to contribute as much as I could with help in publicity and marketing. So we've been a great partnership. And so far, I have really enjoyed the experience. Somebody asked me when I did a recent Zoom interview about imposter syndrome. And I said, well, I've got imposter syndrome as an author. Even though I wrote a book, I still can't believe that I did it. And I think I've got to write another book in order to really feel like a writer. I'm not a stylish, beautiful literary writer, but I have told a story, and I wanted it to be fast moving because I was used to publishing so much fiction, and I'm told that it's very much a page turner. So I feel very happy about that.
It is. It's much more than a business book. I mean, it's melded all of the things that you want to talk about very well. And it's very personal too, which is lovely. What, so you said about a second book. What might that be?
We've got, I want to write about what happened after I sold the company. And I want to write a book which will encompass more of my spiritual journey. I have absolutely no idea if anybody will want to publish it, but I feel there are things that I've got to say that may be of help to other people on their spiritual journeys. But we shall see what happens. Anyway, I will be asking for divine help as I type the words on my computer. And I found when I've got something difficult to write, if I ask for divine help, it usually comes, and I'm often quite surprised about what words are actually coming out on the screen. So I do recommend that to everyone to try.
Do you enjoy the process of writing?
I do enjoy it, and sometimes my mind races so much, and although I'm quite a fast typist, I can't type the words fast enough. It's physically tiring writing a book. I hadn't appreciated how tiring it was, but I love the creativity about it.
Who bought Piatkus?
Piatkus was bought by Little Brown, and Piatkus as an imprint continues. So you can send your personal growth and personal development books to Piatkus. And it's owned by Little Brown in the UK, and Little Brown is part of the Hachette group of companies. So it was a very satisfactory sale. I was very happy.
Did you not think of sending your book to Piatkus? Give you a little bit of an in there?
I don't think Piatkus would have been the right publisher, and I have to tell you that they agreed with that.
They did. Yeah. Okay. Well, Judy, you're also a bereavement counsellor, and as you said, psychodynamics psychotherapist, and you are still practicing?
No, I don't practice.
You don't practice.
But the skills that I learned in my training have stood me in good stead every day of my life. So counselling training is hugely valuable for everybody. Even if you just do a few weeks and learn about how to listen better, that is valuable for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. We need better listeners in the world. A lot more listeners. Judy, thank you. It's been a delight to talk with you, especially as I have feel like I've got such a personal connection to Piatkus, because it played such a big role in my development and my life as well. And thank you for that. I'm grateful for all those books you published that I read.
Sandy, thank you so much for inviting me. onto the program. And I have to say, we had a wonderful time at Piatkus publishing all these books. But if we hadn't published them, I'm sure another publisher would have published them. So you would have had just as much pleasure. But I'm really happy that it was Piatkus that gave you the pleasure.
Yeah, me too. Well, Judy Piatkus, thank you for adding your 10 best spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations. And Judy's memoir, Ahead of Her Time, How a One-Woman Startup Became a Global Publishing Brand, published by Watkins. You can find out more about that on Amazon and Waterstones and all good bookstores. And you can find out more about Judy at her website, judypiatkus.com. And if you're interested in joining the Conscious Cafe or starting a group of your own, you can learn more about that at consciouscafe.org. One more thing before we close. I just want to say that if your life is stressful and unfulfilling, if you would like to make changes but don't know how, there is a book that's going to be my bookworm for September on the No BS Spiritual Book Club website that I would highly recommend, and that is The Necktie and the Jaguar by Carl Greer. It's a memoir, but it also has questions to help you change your story. So you can find out more information about that by going to Carl's website at carlgreer, greer.com. And you can also read a little excerpt from it next month on the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to Judy Piatkus for being with us. You can watch previous videos in this series on our YouTube channel, as well as at the video page at the No BS Spiritual Book Club.com. That's it for this week. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you at the same time next week. Bye-bye.